This is not a lecture. It is not a sermon. It is a clarion call from the graveyard of history. Clarion call from the voices that are smoldering in the graves. Despite that torment, their spirits keep marching on to liberty and prosperity. They are not gone, they are here. That is why we are here. We must listen to what they are telling us. The voices of Nkrumah, the voices of Mumi, the voices of Toussaint Louverture, the voices of Gavi, the voices of Dubois, the voices of Wallace Johnson, Macaulay, Kingsley Haywood, the voices far as well as near. This is why we are here today. The voices of Equiano, who in 1779 could write about the Zong case, where 30 enslaved Africans were dumped in the ocean by a British company in order to collect cargo insurance. Those are the voices speaking to us, and the voices of those 30 Africans under the waters, welcoming young Africans, thinking that they are just there, wondering why they were there. Only for those young Africans indicating that, no, they are not enslaved by the might of the gun. They are enslaved by poverty, leaving their countries in search of better lives. And they became more tormented under the waters and asked themselves the fundamental question: why Africa? Those who turn their back at their own history will turn their back at their own future. Those who are lost to themselves will be lost to the world and will continue to become victims of blind destiny. Their eyes will be lost of vision. Their hearts will be deprived of a mission. They will sink into the abyss and disappear without trace. But those who had brought us here, those who have called us not to commemorate but to make a stand, are still with us. And that's why we are here. 120 years is not just an event. It's connected to a history of a continent, enslaved and taken across the waters, but never conquered, never made slaves. Their hearts spoke the language of freedom. Their minds spoke the language of liberty. And they united hands with mine to struggle for their freedom. Despite being enslaved 300 years ago, Equiano, Cubano, all sought to speak about the evils of slavery, to a point that the slave owners began to listen, not because they had a heart that felt, but they had interests that demanded that they should listen. Because America became free, the umbilical cord was cut, and there was no longer any linkage between taking our people across the waters to unite them with the means of production to produce the raw material that was needed in the other part of the world. So consequently, slavery did no longer serve their interests. And therefore, they had to listen to the voices of the abolitionists, those who spoke to them about the cruelty of slavery, the inhumanity of slavery. And consequently, they began to use those abolitionists as those people who will help them to eradicate slavery, not because of its evil nature, but so that they will be able to settle the enslaved back to their homeland, not as free people, but to be there to help them to dominate their homeland. From removing the people from the land, they were now going to remove the land from the people. And that mission could only be achieved by using our people themselves. That is why they established Freetown. 1820, the American Colonization Society had to work for the resettlement of those who were free from slavery back to their homeland. 1821, they turned towards Liberia. 1847, Liberia became a republic. And 1848, Roberts from Norfolk, Virginia, became the first president of Liberia. But the intention was to leave the Africans at the level they were, poor and deprived, so that ultimately they will want to go back to a land that they were already, that they already put under subjugation. So they were not working for the liberation of the Africans. And that is what was seen by the Frederick Douglasses. That no, they're talking about Africa for the African, but they did not mean that. We have to struggle to earn our keep where they've brought us. But we must also work for the liberation of our people at home. History teaches us that the African people and great achievements that we must recognize today. Hope is not lost. The African people being taken into the Caribbean eventually became the majority because the slave owner will want to breed the slaves. And eventually the slaves became the majority. And 1804, Toussaint Louverture led the Haitian Revolution, and they created the Haitian Republic, not on the African continent, but there where they were enslaved. They were taking the land from the people, but the slave owners, those who were enslaved in the Caribbean, were beginning to take the land from the slave owners in order to build republics far afield, without having any desire to colonize any territory. You see, from our domination, we are expanding in the world to take charge of the world, to lead the world, because as our ancestors said, we suffered injustice. And the land cried for justice. And we answered to the cry of the land to create liberty. And because of that, the world must learn from us. And they did learn. Haiti became liberated. All the countries, Cuba, Barbados, they all began to struggle. Eventually Jamaica. But as this struggle between the United Kingdom and the newly found America expanded, the economic interests clashed. They began to work against slavery whilst the southern states of America were still slave owning. Not only slave owning to work on the farm, it became more lucrative to breed and sell slaves. So the abolitionist movement expanded. The southern part of the United States, which relied on the raw materials, the northern part, which relied on the southern part for raw materials, began to see people eventually breeding slaves and selling rather than working on the land. They were working against the industrialization of the North, and therefore a contradiction between the southern slave owners and the northern industrialists expanded, leading to a civil war, 1861 to 1865. 170,000 Africans fought for the Union in that struggle, earning their dignity because of their military might in saving the Union. They had to give them support to become liberated. And Africans, therefore, in the United States, also began to fight for their rights so that they can take charge of who they are in that country where they have served so much, suffered so much, and helped to build. It is their country, even though Africa is also their country. So we began to see a struggle, not only to take over land in the Caribbean, but also struggle for rights in the United States, and all combining together, leading to 1900. 1900 is not an ordinary year. It is a year when the British Crown began to expand its domination far afield in the Falkland Islands as well as in our part of the continent. They came up with the Imperial Act of 1843 to plan how to take charge of our territories, how to build executive and legislative councils and establish settlements controlled by the British Crown, where their law will remain. The Privy Council, advising the Queen, created the law in terms of ordinances that they utilized to rule our people. But in order to consolidate power, when they were fighting among themselves, in 1884 they had to meet at the Berlin Conference, organized by Bismarck, who saw that Germany as a power had to expand its base in all the colonies and eventually prepare itself, position itself to take over the colonies of the other European powers. The other European powers agreed to attend. And the Act of Berlin of 1885 created the basis for the European powers to have peace among themselves and share the booty of our continent, the river Niger, the river Congo, and all its environs, to explore. Geographical societies were established to do exploration, scientific exploration, not for the advancement of science, for the advancement of colonial domination, knowledge for colonial domination. Ultimately, we were completely dominated. We know in the Gambia, up to 1900, they did not have full control. They had to kill the 4-day Kabas, the 4-day sailors, ultimately to have control of the Gambia. This is what they did all over the continent. By 1900, they began to have effective control. But Africans in the diaspora, Africans at home, began to get education, the knowledge of liberation. They became aware that two fundamental tools are absolutely essential for liberation. We must have awareness, we must have organization. Without awareness and organization, there is no power. Just like Frederick Douglass has said, power concedes to no one without a demand. It never did, it never will. Nobody gives you freedom. It has to be demanded, and it has to be backed by power to liberate self. It's a long history. We have short time to narrate it. But 1900, Henry Sylvester Williams convened the Pan-African Conference. Africans in the diaspora and at home participated. Queen Victoria saw the might of our people and agreed that the demands they will make will be listened to, but it was never listened to. They transformed the conference into solidarity of the African people against racial discrimination, because everywhere they were educated. Henry Sylvester Williams was a barrister, but they were subjected to discrimination irrespective of their knowledge. Their salvation had to come to uniting with the people in order to liberate the African continent. The conference served its purpose. It galvanized the people who will be ready to be the architects of the liberation of the continent. That is why 1919 was not a surprise, because after 1900, the European powers who met in Berlin began to fight among themselves to divide the colonies once more. 1914 to 1918, vicious First World War. At the end, those who were victorious met in Versailles in order to look at ways where they will demand reparation from the losers. Germany was a loser. The Ottoman Empire was a loser. In 1985, those powers, Germany, United Kingdom, France, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire. You still hear Africans talk about Ottoman Empire. It was an imperial power dominating throughout the Middle East, moving into North Africa. These were all powers. Denmark, Norway, all these countries were imperial powers at the time. Belgium. The base of their wealth to build capitalism came from that colonial domination. We must never lose sight of that history. And they must never lose sight of their responsibility in eradicating that future of their history by adding value to the African continent and the African people. Essentially, in 1919, they met to prepare the Treaty of Versailles. And in that meeting, people like Dubois requested from the President of the United States, President Wilson, that they should accompany him to France. Yes, he took some of them. But when they demanded that side by side with the discussion on reparation, they must also talk about self-determination of the African people, he was kept aside. But they never gave up. Our ancestors never gave up. They knew what they wanted. And Blaise Diagne was met by Dubois. Blaise Diagne, because of the policy of assimilation, was a deputy in the French Parliament. And by virtue of the fact that he could mobilize 100,000 Africans to fight for France during the First World War, he was given recognition. Clemenceau has to recognize him. And he approached him, and he accepted and told them not to talk about what he has done, but they can go ahead. That is how the first Pan-African Congress took place in France in 1919. Africans fought and died at the Battle of Marne. You have your Flanders poppies. Dubois has shown how, without any protection, they were marching against the enemy, being shot and died, until all of them were massacred. For what purpose? For others to continue to dominate them. The Pan-Africanists said no, and warned me in terms of time. You say we should not violate the time. Give me 5 minutes wherever you feel that I should come to conclusion. Because this is a long history, and it's a rich history. It's a history that you can continue narrating for days, not for minutes. In 1919, the Pan-Africanists met. And you talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But when the Pan-Africanists met, they came up with a resolution. Now listen to the resolution of 1919. They said that you are meeting here to take over the possession of the conquered powers. We will not allow that to happen anymore. Germany owned all these territories. Over 20 million people were under the German territories. And we will not allow you to take all those 20 million people and subjugate them. What those people demanded, who were under the Ottoman Empire but struggled to overthrow them in the Middle East, is what must be demanded by all people everywhere, in Asia, in Latin America, everywhere in the globe. That is the right to self-determination. That as a start, all the German colonies will no longer become the booty of the victorious powers. They must be allowed to be on a trusteeship system under the League of Nations. And those powers that will be given responsibility of serving as trustees will be obliged to obey our demand. And what is that demand? That the land of those people will belong to them. Independence is coming. Sovereignty is coming. The land will belong to them, and they should be allowed to make as much use of that land as they are capable. Yes, we will allow investment in the land, but investment in the land must be contained, and whatever is derived from it must be utilized in terms of taxation to provide services to the people who are in those trustee countries. Number one. That the minerals could be invested into and developed, but limited in time, and must not be exhausted, and must be tasked, and what is derived from it must be utilized to promote the services that the people need. Forced labor must be abolished, slavery must be abolished, and labor must be properly rewarded. That going further, they must ensure that education is given free of charge to those people who are now being prepared for self-determination and independence. And it must not only be done in the language of the colonials, but also the language of those people, their indigenous languages. Imagine, 1990. That the education must have three characteristics. One, there must be academic as well as technical education. And education in culture, meaning education of normative values. So you're talking about technical, academic, and socialization education in values. What can be more comprehensive? 1990. That the teachers must be trained free of charge. And they must be prepared in these three areas to be able to transfer knowledge and values to the children in those countries. And what was more profound, and that is the basis of this sharing today, and that is the way forward, because I've been told it's 5 minutes left. They said immediately the Africans must be given the opportunity to engage in self-government. And education must be expanded to ensure that government exists for the people and not the people for government. Government exists for the people and not the people for government. What can be more fundamental in terms of democracy? That is the farthest end. That is the democracy of the sovereign republic. They were talking about republics in 1919, where government exists for the people and not the people for government. And finally, as knowledge and education expand, for Africa to be ruled by the consent of Africans. This is documented. It's right here in this book, quoted from Dubois. You can see what has happened to us. We became united 1921, 1923, 1927, where African women in New York organized the Fourth Pan-African Congress in 1927. We must remember them. And 1945, we can remember Ami Ashwood Garvey, marveling Churchill by declaring that we, supported by all colonized people, are demanding and we must emancipate ourselves. That was our conclusion at the 5th Pan-African Congress, where the Nkrumahs, the Jomo Kenyattas, all of them were ready now to come back to the continent and liberate the continent. Yes, from 1945, 1957, Ghana has become independent. The liberation of Ghana was meaningless unless it was linked to the total liberation of the continent. 1958 April, Nkrumah called all the free states, African states, to prepare the ground for the liberation of the continent. December, all liberation movements came to Ghana. By 1963, liberation was there. 31 states met in Addis Ababa to sign that declaration to establish the OAU. 31 states. Africa was marching towards her liberation. And Article 2 emphasizes that the primary objective was to decolonize the continent. That's the trajectory. We are now to move forward. They talked about the NEPADs, Africa Continental Free Trade Zones. But history teaches us, as Nkrumah told us, that this Africa of 1.3 million people is not a small continent. It has all the resources in the world that others want, that we also want. It has the Caribbean and the states, its diaspora. Maritime development in the world, whole mercantile system was based on the triangular trade, and Africa is well positioned. It has the resources. If the World Bank, out of 11 billion, could now be giving loans to all these countries in the world, when what an individual dictator, and I don't want to become, go to that level, can save 11 billion in a Swiss bank. Can you see the immense wealth that Nkrumah said one country cannot develop? Because they had reduced us to raw material producers and importers of everything else, and their banking system controlled the world. So what was necessary, and is still necessary, is to create an African Central Bank, an African Investment Bank, an African Monetary Fund. All countries will contribute to that fund. We'll build up all the multinational corporations that we want on the continent, finance them, build up their capacity so that they can do the mining, harness the oil, harness all sorts of resources to be able to advance linkage between agricultural production, mineral production, with transforming it into manufactured goods and building machines. Nkrumah had told them that if you rely on others for production of your manufactured goods, there will be value added and you will still be dependent on them. You'll have deficit after deficit. If you rely on for the production of your machines, even if you manufacture, you'll still rely on them, and that's what happened to Tanzania. You'll hear them, why did Tanzania fail? Well, that's precisely why it failed. Because Africa failed to unite. You can only advance, but not so far. So in that respect, what we now need is an Africa where all leaders realize that we are powerful. Why are we so weak? We are powerful. Why are we so weak? We have all the resources in the world, but we are not utilizing them for our liberation. What is the direction? The direction is that we have moved from Africa of monarchs, and now we are moving to Africa of the people. Africa of the people, Africa of the sovereign people. We must ensure that the sovereign people take over power everywhere on the continent by knowing who they are, knowing that they are not separated into religions and regions, and ethno-linguistic groups. They are Africans. They are citizens of a continent, but now the starting point, citizens of countries. Let's start from the citizens of countries, develop the consciousness to become citizens of a continent so that we can determine who will rule us. Africa must be ruled by the consent of Africans, and government must exist for people and not the people for government. Thank you very much.